So Alien Romulus was my most anticipated movie of last year by the time release rolled around. I absolutely adore the Alien franchise. I thought Fede Alvarez being attached was a heaven-sent miracle if Ridley wasn't able to return to complete the David trilogy. All the trailers and sneak peeks were amazing. All the practical effects they were showing off looked great. I loved the casting. It was everything I had hoped for. But then the first screenings had happened and the world caught wind of a particular thing in the movie, and we all know what it is, but we'll get to that later. But I try not to let others sway my opinions on movies, especially before I have seen them, so I still went in very excited. And I was just disappointed. The constant callbacks, the thing we're not going to talk about yet, and the whole third act just didn't work for me. I talk about it quite a lot in my Alien Ranked video and even in my end of year list video, so go and watch those if you want my initial thoughts. But ever since my first viewing, I've been hesitant to revisit this one. However, I wanted to know what I felt about this movie, what I really felt when removed from all the conversation, removed from my expectations, and removed from my initial disappointment. So I did an Alien binge. I got to see the classics of Alien and Aliens. I got to watch the Alien 3 Legacy cut, which is by far my favourite cut of the movie now. I slugged through Alien Resurrection and grinned all the way through Prometheus and Covenant. So that brought me all the way back to Alien Romulus. I popped in my disc and here we are. I would say it's only natural to start at the beginning, and the opening sequence is absolutely sick. It's very suspenseful and the reveal of the xenomorph shell is so cool. I'm not entirely sure how this xeno managed to fossilize itself like this, but it's at least a very neat idea. Apparently he covers himself in this self-secreting goo to form the cocoon, which again I don't get the logistics of, but it's cool enough to make me not think about it too much. And like I mentioned in my intro, the practical effects this movie was selling the audience on was a big part of my excitement, and yeah, the very practical and old school sci-fi sets are insanely impressive. The scale and grit to them is something not every film gets to have or even gets right. I think the fact this is set just after the first Alien is also very important in this aspect, because prequels often suffer in looking too new compared to the films they're set before. Take for instance Star Wars, that's always had this criticism because the prequels always look so polished compared to the original trilogy. Prometheus and Covenant also get a similar criticism, but Prometheus and Cov kinda get away with it in my opinion, just because the Nostromo is like a piece of shit. It isn't exactly the kind of ship that Prometheus was. It's a crappy old mining vessel, and thus the newer polished look of the prequels kind of works. But Romulus takes place partly on a mining vessel and on LV-410, a planet to home a mining colony. So the aesthetics need to be consistent with Alien, and they are. I mean, obviously what we see is much grander, much more lived in, and not precisely the same, but real effort was made to not only make this all technologically and aesthetically consistent with the first film, but also create its own unique feeling of dirt and grit. And it goes along for the entire movie. Every set on the Romulus and Remus space station looks absolutely immense. Some of my favourite sets in the whole series come from this movie. Some of them you only see for a moment or two, but it goes a very long way with making this film feel real. It has a grounded nature that not many of the other films have. Everything seems to have some function. The design sticks so close to not just Alien, but aliens in the labs and other areas. Obviously the CG used in this movie, a fair amount really, but it's how the film stitches those elements together to create visual harmony. The war has never been against green screens and CGI, it's been against the over-reliance on them, and I think the film perfectly demonstrates how a marriage between those elements is supposed to look and feel. Also, bearing in mind this movie cost $80 million to make, so in the grand scheme of things it isn't even that costly when compared to complete CG fests like the average MCU film, which cost in the hundreds of millions. Another great aspect of this movie is seeing colonies on other planets. We get a very small peek at the Hadley's Hope colony on LV-426 in Aliens, but that's mostly cut, and what we do get to see in the special edition is sick. But most of the runtime is spent during the aftermath, and in Covenant we know they're carrying a colony ship to Urgai 6, but we never see that come to fruition, so it's an interesting bit of world building for the Alien universe, something we've not really had before, at least not on this scale. And in Alien Covenant, you know, they're talking about this new colony on Urgai 6 like it's going to be a paradise, like there's going to be lake houses and fresh water, and there's going to be grass and fields and wheat and all of this stuff, but here we see the realities of some of these colonies. More things that are new is the story. We've had stories of people trying to get back home safely. We've had stories of people trying to discover our roots, stories of building new worlds, but we've not yet had a story of someone trying to escape, someone trying to find a better place. There's more hope in this movie than most of the franchise, and the reward isn't just going to be getting to go home safe, but getting a new life entirely. It really gives us something huge to root for since we have a primary protagonist in Rain. I do wish they did more of a pastiche of the first Alien, where we never really find out that Rain is the protagonist until about halfway through, but for the necessities of this story, I understand giving us a clear protagonist from the beginning. I'm not the biggest fan of our secondary characters though. A lot of them feel very hollow and nondescript, but I think Andy is done very well, and the reveal that he's a synthetic is done very well also. It's just a very small drop of milky blood, nothing big or dramatic, just enough to let the audience know. And listen, Kaylee Spaney is a great lead, truly, but David Johnson as Andy is running this show. The way he flicks in and out of his upgraded mode is so well done. His performance is by far the standout. I've been keeping an eye on him since Rye Lane, and I hope he continues to get work. He's just such a fantastic rising star, and I hope to see both him and Spaney in the sequels for Romulus. But like I said, for everyone else, I'm not in love. Spike Fern is doing okay as the douchebag, though the writing of his character is a little weak. Archie Renault is barely a presence in any scene he's in. Aileen Wu does okay with what little she's given, but it isn't much. And Isabella Merced is doing great with what little she's given, which is a bit more than the other supporting. Her gut-wrenching scream during the chest bursting scene is a highlight, but her role is a lot more important than just the witness of the chest burster. She's the mother of this film. Because basically her character Kay is pregnant, which is central to the film's conflicts and plot, but it is also central to the concepts of Alien. Now there are so many themes of motherhood in this movie, but for the wider franchise, being a mother and childbirth are huge themes. For a start, there have been numerous claims to the argument that the entire concept of the chestburster and such is an allegory for giving birth and how much it can damage a mother, the burden of pregnancy, even having the facehugger non-consensually impregnate the victims, which then they're given offspring they're forced to give birth to, also giving way to the sexual assault and abortion rights themes that have been long discussed when discussing Alien. Not to mention this idea that the first victim we see of this fate, and only in the original film, is Cain, a biological man. I think the significance of making him suffer through this process of assault and birth is very important to the weight we put into the motherhood themes of the franchise. Even the ship's operating system is called Mother, by the way. And then from there, Aliens is littered with that stuff. Ripley losing her own daughter to time but adopting Newt as a kind of replacement. The Queen is introduced, who is the mother to all facehuggers and Xenos. Alien 3 tackles the loss involved with being a mother sometimes, losing Newt in the opening and then having to suffer through carrying a Xeno herself and sacrificing her life to destroy it as she gives birth, which could be an allegory for maternal death. Then Alien Resurrection is all about motherhood. We have the Queen who gives birth to the alien literally known as the newborn, who thinks Ripley is its mother, who she then also has to let go. Prometheus tackles the creation of life itself, and the protagonist of Dr. Elizabeth Shaw is unable to have children due to being sterile, but then gets impregnated by an alien and forcing her to have a makeshift abortion. And obviously in Covenant we go through the entire process of creating life and having love for your children despite them being what they are, the unconditional love of a parent. Now obviously that's a very general overview and there's tons of pieces written on the subject, but all of that to say, motherhood is a very essential aspect to these movies and Romulus understands that very, very well. Even the name of the stations, Romulus and Remus, relate to this. In Roman mythology, Romulus and Remus Remus were two children born of Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia. They were sentenced to die because they were a threat to King Amulius's throne, as they may have had a valid claim. They were abandoned near the river Tiber to die, but were saved by the god Tibernius, and thus were raised by a wolf often referred to as Lupa. You may have seen the popular bronze statue of two boys suckling on a she-wolf's teat. That's in reference to this story. Eventually they were adopted by a shepherd and grew to be fierce leaders, leading to an instance of fratricide where Romulus kills his brother Remus and founds the city of Rome, which is often referred to as a woman and even closely relates to Roma, a female deity who personifies the ideals of Rome. There's so much to that story about familiar relationships and mothers, the nurturing of young and what that young turn into, and I think it's an interesting thing to pull from this story. Siblings being a big theme of this movie as well, especially in Rain and Andy's case. Though Andy is a droid, he is referred to as Rain's brother throughout the runtime, and she was planning on leaving him behind to find greatness in a new city, find a new life, much like Romulus and Remus. But in the end, she doesn't, and maybe that's why the stations failed and our protagonists don't. Now back to the movie. They bring back a lot of the original sound effects, like the mother boot up sound, or like when they first go through the space station, the vents make this noise, which is exactly the same effect as when Dallas is travelling through the vents looking for the xenomorph. It's nice little details like this that really tie the movies together in a very nice fashion, and another little detail I enjoy is how the cryo chambers are in a W like the Weyland-Yutani logo. It's a little thing, but it really sells how the Way U brand sells themselves. A couple things I don't like are still prevalent though. They reuse a bunch of old dialogue from the other movies, like,
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
Or,
get away from her, you bitch!
Get away from her, you bitch.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
it is needless fanfare and is very distracting, the latter example being the biggest eye roll I think I've ever given a movie. And it doesn't stop there. The film is constant homages to previous films, and I understand loving them and wanting to give them a lot of credit and love, but at some point you need to stand on your own. At some point I do feel this movie has a bit of a problem with being a greatest hits album. It's kind of like the Michael Jackson album History, how it's in one sense Mike's 9th studio album full of great new original songs, but then the other half is just established Michael hits that feel they have no place on there. It kind of makes the whole album feel disjointed and without a real independent identity. And now I think it's time to talk about the real issue. The floaty face Bilbo Baggins ghoul is awful. There is quite literally no need for him. I understand they wanted an android to create tension, and since Ash was the original villain, it kind of makes sense to want to use his model. However, I think it's not only disrespectful to use him since Ian Holm had passed and not been able to consent to this, but the effect also looks terrible in my opinion. And the best way around this issue is to either just use the practical animatronic that they had built for the scene before replacing its face, or just use an entirely different model. I think using Michael Fassbender may have been effective since David is the only other android villain we really come across, and since Fassbender is still alive they could have used him practically. Or they could have just used Lance Henriksen, who is still alive and can consent, and they could have just de-aged him. Yes, it would have looked weird, but it would have looked less weird, and it is obviously not as bad as digging up a grave for a touch of nostalgia. Plus, just using the animatronic that they had already built would have been an even nicer homage to Alien 3, where they used an animatronic of Bishop. I even bought this movie on 4K just so I can see this ugly effect in the highest definition possible, and granted the effect does look enormously better in this release than it did in theaters, but still it's a major knock against the movie for me. And it isn't just when he's explicitly in the room. Just when you think you've moved on and you're safe, he shows up on some monitor or other looking like a Metal Gear Solid cutscene. It is so distracting to every scene it's in, but moving on. I have to talk about something I like before I lose my mind. So I am in love with this awesome colour palette the movie chooses to go with. There's a lot of reds and yellows, and it really sets it apart from the dark tinges of green in the other films and even the cold blues of Prometheus and Covenant. The film also lights very well. With these practical sets, they're able to get very creative with the lighting and not just wash out the entire frame, and it works so well. It sets an atmosphere I absolutely adore. It is so smoky and cold but angry. I also find it interesting how this film makes the facehuggers a big antagonist of the film, equal to the xenomorphs. There's this one sequence that's like that one scene in Aliens with Newt and Ripley, but it's far better, more tense, higher stakes and better directed, and I love the added bonus of making Andy an absolute beast through his upgrade. But they continue to be a constant threat throughout the movie, and the script establishes more lore in the universe to make things like the facehuggers more of an interesting threat. Like how they operate through heat, and they use this additional lore to create a very tense scene where our main characters all have to shuffle through a room full of facehuggers whilst the room is set to the same temp as their bodies. It's again a new and interesting idea that's not been used yet. It also expands upon things we do know but not much explored, like how we know xenomorphs have a rapid growth cycle, but we never really see what that cycle looks like. This cocoon that it goes into that we have never seen before even looks like a vagina, and it gives birth to this newly sized and grown xenomorph, more to do with this idea of birth and motherhood and the horror experience it can be for some people. And now just a quick list of things I like and wanted to mention. The chestburst scene is great. The way we see the x-ray of it breaking through the ribs on the way out really sells the brutality of the chest bursting process. We have an interesting turn that this ship wasn't using the xenomorph to create bioweapons but to create an antidote for death and sickness. Rook reverse engineered the Xeno back to the goo that David and the Prometheus crew found on LV-223. It's the essence of life we see the engineers use to create life or destroy it. It's a cute flip on the goals of the company in nearly every other installment. The gravity sequence is also very sick, filmed beautifully, and is also a very fun idea this franchise hasn't played with yet. The floating acid is just such a cool obstacle that is far more interesting of a challenge than a straight up xenomorph standoff. Also, there's this whole other threat of the station crashing into this planet's asteroid belt that provides this whole other imminent threat that adds another layer of tension on top of this film. The third act comes about because Kay takes this mutagen made from the goo and it rapidly progresses her pregnancy just like a xenomorph life cycle, but she ends up giving birth to this human xeno hybrid akin to the Alien Resurrection newborn, but way less disgusting and far more of a threat. I think they did the concept so much better here than in Resurrection, and on my initial viewing I wasn't too into it, but this time around I was fully sold on it. And I think it's so neat that Alvarez took this idea and experimented so heavily with it, the way it suckles on Kay's life, draining her of her blood, giving this allegory of breastfeeding and again bringing back this whole motherhood theme. And the design is so cool, and it even looks a lot like an engineer, which makes sense if it's born from their goo. And I like how the film evolves its threats based on the stages of a Xeno life cycle. The first antagonistic force we battle is the facehuggers, a whole battalion of them even. Then we of course get the chestburster, which then creates the Xeno as the primary antagonist, but then we learn of the goo, which then gives us a new antagonist in the offspring, which is the big bad for the finale. It's like the mother, the child, and then the mutation. Then they do a very cool homage to the first Alien, again, where they use the acid blood to blow a hole and flush out the offspring. But I like the idea of using the acid to do this, using the one thing they've been trying to avoid the whole movie, which is blowing a hole in the space station using the blood, and then also using the asteroid belt to finish the job, the other threat they've been trying to avoid this entire movie, turning disadvantages and weaknesses into advantages. Overall, I enjoyed this movie far more than I did originally. It's such a wild ride and uses so many different kinds of obstacles and threats in so many unique ways. It's a true to form horror movie with likable characters. The only issues this movie faces are of course with Ian Holm's corpse and the incessant callbacks to the other movies, which some of them are great and the homages are to be expected, but they become very obnoxious and distracting at certain points, which I think take away from this film having its own identity entirely, but still, I kind of love this one now. But that's just me. What do you think? Have you seen Alien Romulus? If so, what did you think? If not, will you? And whether it's one about a crew of misfits trying to find a better life elsewhere or not, as always, keep watching movies.